In Germany, election winner Friedrich Merz, Conservatives and the Social Democrats advanced in complex coalition talks. The two parties now promise a tougher stance on immigration, industry support and a boost to the economy. The office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that a delegation will be sent to Doha on Monday to advance ceasefire negotiations. This comes after an invitation from Arab mediators was accepted. China announces new tariffs on over $2.6 billion worth of Canadian agricultural and food products. Beijing's move mirrors Canada's decision to impose 100% and 25% import duties on Chinese electric vehicles, steel and aluminium. Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney is the front-runner to succeed Justin Trudeau as the Canadian Prime Minister. The winner of the Liberal Party's election is expected to be announced by this evening. Russia has announced the capture of another eastern Ukrainian village in the Sumy region. However, General Staff of Ukraine's military has made no mention of it falling into Russian hands. And a state of emergency has been declared in New York as wildfires rage across Long Island. 3 of the 4 fires have been contained, with a major highway and military base evacuated. Our top story is the violence in Syria's coastal region, which has now claimed reportedly the lives of more than 1,000 people, including 750 civilians, following 2 days of clashes between security forces and pro-Assad fighters. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has now reported 745 civilians, mostly from the Alawite minority, have been killed in shootings. This marks one of the deadliest escalations in the country's 14-year civil war. The clashes erupted after insurgents attacked the remnants of the Assad regime in Tartus and Latakia. The Syrian interim president Ahmed Shara has called for national unity, but reports of revenge killings and executions even are currently underway. Let's open up this conversation. Professor Madhav Nalapat joining us on the broadcast. Professor Nalapat, troubling things are happening in Syria, and do we actually see some light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, it's a very long, dark tunnel. There's no question about it. And let's be honest, the current quote-unquote president of Syria is basically Al-Qaeda and ISIS. He comes from the Al-Qaeda and ISIS school of diplomacy and statecraft. And very frankly, that has been a huge setback for democratization. Now, the problem was Bashar Assad was no Democrat himself. And most importantly, the last 10 years of his government, he was extremely corrupt and very negligent of any smooth functioning of the government, with the result that the public support for him fell very sharply, including among his own Alawite community. Regrettably, that vacuum was filled by a very hardcore group of militants, basically Turkish-sponsored and with grey zone funds, basically crypto money. Now, whether the crypto money came from Turkey, I don't think Erdogan has much money to play with. Possibly it came, my best guess is it probably came from the Chinese, because they'd be quite delighted to see this kind of confusion take place in Syria. And Assad essentially was Russian. He was not a Chinese asset. And that's why he fled to Moscow. And very frankly, he left behind a very, very divided country. And we are talking in terms of reports. The truth is that from the time al-Shara proclaimed himself president, that's his new name, but in Al-Qaeda he had a different name, they've been systematically killing anybody who's against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Systematically. This is the Taliban on steroids, quite frankly. And as a consequence, there's now hell.
Okay, of course, pretty emphatic and a strong opinion there on what is going on in Syria from Professor Nalapat. Sir, before I let you go, is there an appetite for any third party, third country to actually intervene here at this point of time?
Look, the military bases of the old regime, which are making them useless for al-Sharia to use, and the al-Sharia regime has therefore become much weaker. So it's no accident that suddenly
All right, we're having connection difficulties there with Professor Nalapat, but we've got the gist of his argument over there that things are looking troubled, and at this point of time, it seems pretty obvious that there is very little likelihood of any intervention available at this time. Professor Nalapat, thank you for connecting with us and having this conversation. Let's move on to what's happening in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky will now be heading to Saudi Arabia to meet Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman tomorrow. The two will be discussing, we are told, ways to end the conflict which started after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. After the meeting, US and Ukrainian officials will also be holding talks with hopes that the war will come to a ceasefire settlement sometime soon. The first high-level meeting between US and Ukrainian officials since the heated public and very dramatic argument that took place outside the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky just a couple of weeks ago. The Ukrainian delegation will include the foreign minister, the defense minister, and Zelensky's chief of staff. Also expected to attend are White House envoy Steve Witkoff, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. The three US diplomats are said to lead the American delegation. Let's open up this conversation to Gilbert Doctorow joining us on the broadcast from Brussels. Ms. Doctorow, thanks and appreciate your time. What do you make of the environment in which this conversation in Saudi Arabia is about to happen? Have we ameliorated the situation post the Washington visit?
I think we have to look to a broader context, and that is precisely what the United States has done in the last 4 or 5 days, starting with the suspension of all military aid on its way to Ukraine or being warehoused in Poland. That was suspended until it's clear that the Ukrainians are ready to negotiate in good faith and with some sense of realism. More important still was what happened a few days ago when the United States withheld or cut all intelligence access for satellite and other forms of targeting information and defense information, that is a notification of incoming aircraft, which the Ukrainians had enjoyed up until then. This is still more massive pressure on Ukraine to face the realities of the situation as they enter into negotiations and to put behind them all of the brave or bravado talk about imposing conditions that essentially would take from the Russians, who are the victors, all of their gains and would present them as the losers in this.
Okay, so Mr. Doctorow, how do you expect this to play out? Because obviously a ceasefire negotiation will have to be an agreement both met with the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians are not on the table in Saudi Arabia. So how does the intermediary conversation play out?
Well, the Russians are the winning side, that they will agree to anything that resembles a fair end to the war is obvious. The Ukrainians have been living in a world of irreality, which has been encouraged first by the Biden administration and then by all the European allies up to yesterday. They're all speaking as if Ukraine can continue the war indefinitely. Now, let's go back to the Oval Office fracas. What happened there? There was an exchange between Zelensky and Trump, which directly relates to the United States' latest actions cutting off Ukraine to the intelligence it needs to both engage in offensive attacks on Russia and to defend itself against incoming aircraft. In that exchange, President Trump told Zelensky that, you know, my friend, if you had not received American military aid at the start of the war, you Ukrainians could not have fought for more than a few days and perhaps a maximum of 2 weeks. To which Zelensky responded, "Oh no, not at all. I've heard that talk coming from Putin, suggesting that Mr. Trump is a dupe of Putin, which is not a very good way to get on with the American president. But personal relations aside, the matter here is that the Ukrainians have refused to recognize reality. They pretend that they are winning, and they pretend that they can enjoy the winner's spoils, and that Russia should succumb to their demands to withdraw and to pay reparations and whatever else. This, I think, the test in coming up in reality will be for the American negotiators to see if the Ukrainian negotiating side has come back to down to earth, faces reality, and understands that they are losing this war, and that if they don't conclude a peace quickly, there'll be nothing left of their country.
All right. Of course, the Ukrainians will have some enlightened self-interest on several of these items as well. They would like to secure their country's future as well. And I can imagine it's going to be a difficult conversation, but at least the conversation is beginning to find a conclusion to this, rather than just the rhetoric and hyperbole of one-upmanship that we've seen over the past couple of years. Gilbert Doctorow, for your thoughts on that. Thank you for joining us. Let's move on. Germany's conservative bloc, the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union, have announced their intention to enter a formal coalition negotiations with the Social Democratic Party. The conservative elected winner, Friedrich Merz, said that they have concluded the consultations between the CDU, CSU and SPD. They've also drawn a joint exploratory paper. Let's have a look at what Friedrich Merz had to say.
Ich kann Ihnen mitteilen, dass wir vor einer knappen Stunde die Beratungen zwischen CDU, CSU und SPD abgeschlossen haben. Wir haben ein gemeinsames Sondierungspapier erstellt und wir haben in einer ganzen Reihe von Sachfragen Einigkeit erzielt. Ich will, bevor ich auf Einzelheiten zu sprechen komme, sagen, dass dies alles in den letzten Tagen in einer ausgesprochen guten und sehr kollegialen Atmosphäre stattgefunden hat.
All right, let's pick up this conversation with Siddharth Mudgal, who contested in the Bundestag elections in 2025. Siddharth, thank you very much for joining us. Can you help us understand what the situation currently is in terms of a likelihood conversation, and where do you end it? Where do you see it ending?
First and foremost, thanks for having me here. Just to make it clear, what has happened right now is a first exploratory talk between CSU, CDU and SPD, the center-right and the center-left parties. And what they typically do is they assess common grounds on which a potential coalition can be formed. So let me be very clear, this initial talk is based on pragmatism. It is based on dealing with the global uncertainty right now. It's focused on economic stagnation, uncertainty with NATO and the expenditures which the US is making there. And the, let's say, the public demand on stricter migration policies as well as strong infrastructure. So there, I think what has been achieved is a very, very good agreement. For example, Germany has now, or the parties have agreed to have a special fund made up of 500 billion euros over 10 years, where they will really, invest in infrastructure digitalization. They've also agreed that defense spending over and above 1% will be outside the debt break. This is very important. What has been also agreed is that there will be a lot of tax rebates, specifically for the middle class. There will be corporate tax incentives. Energy costs will go down. And most importantly, on the migration topic, it has been agreed that on one side, there will be a strong focus on curbing illegal migration. But on the other side, there's a strong agreement and commitment on the welcoming culture of Germany for qualified labor. So, for example, visas will be expedited. And on the other hand, as I said, the asylum rules will be stabilized. Once again, let me make it very clear. Asylum is a moral responsibility of Germany as well, to provide asylum to people who really need our help. At the same time, we need to protect our borders. We need to create space for people who our country really needs.
Okay, Mr. Mudgal, fair enough. But Germany has seen grand coalitions that have lasted and delivered stable governments? And that is obviously the next question. Can a larger, broader coalition deliver a stable government to Germany?
Absolutely. I believe that the parties are strong-willed to deliver a stable coalition. Let's also understand that the government's focus should be on revival of economic, let's say, issues, stabilization, also security, and not necessarily a radical reform immediately. So if they're sticking to this agenda, then I think there are strong chances of a stable government coming out. And let's also not forget, we have AfD, which won 20% of the votes, which is approximately 10 million people who voted for AfD. The three parties really need to get their act together and make sure that they are a strong government delivering value for the German people, but also for the world.
All right. Siddharth Mudgal joining us from Germany. Thank you very much for putting things in perspective as we track the talks which are expected to deliver culmination and hopefully a stable government in Germany very shortly. With that, we take a short break. See you in a few minutes.